Hey, welcome back, A-Push Kids. We're here for our next lecture in Unit 2, Period 3 for AP US History. Today we're going to be piggybacking off of the information we covered last time over the French and Indian War, and we're going to be going chronologically from the end of that in about 1864, 1865, and we're going to go all the way up to the beginning of the American Revolution, and we'll be discussing the shots heard around the world in April of 1775. Our standard and our essential question for this particular lecture is from Learning Objective 3C. It says, explain how British colonial policies regarding North America led to the Revolutionary War. And there's two parts to this. So there's two key ideas. They both are right here. We'll kind of be touching on both of them as we go through this lecture chronologically today. So key idea 1 says British efforts to collect taxes without direct colonial representation or consent and to assert imperial authority of the colonies began to unite the colonists against perceived and real constraints on their economic activities and political rights. And then our second key idea is the efforts for American independence was energized by colonial leaders as well as by popular movements that included the political activism of laborers, artisans, and women. So this kind of road to the American Revolution that we're talking about here today, we've got, once again, those two big ideas. One, it's this change in British policies, and then you have important people and groups on the American side that are significant to this entire thing. So if we start to kind of think about the chronology of this, what we're going to look at here is we're going to look at these dates, and we're going to kind of dive into some more of these things in more detail here in a second. So this gives us kind of the brief outline to begin with. But the French and Indian War really is the start of this road towards the American Revolution. And it's once again important for us to understand what was it before. All right, the French and Indian War is this turning point. It's this kind of CCOT prompt for us to understand, this continuity and change over time. And so we have to understand the before so we can understand the after. And the before is really defined by two major types of relationships with England. The first one is the mercantilistic relationship, that economic relationship where the colonies were there to provide aid for the financial well-being of the mother country, providing raw materials in exchange for finished products, etc., etc. On the other side, you've got the political relationship, this relationship of salutary neglect where we got to rule ourselves through things like the House of Burgesses, New England town meetings, fundamental orders of Connecticut, all that kind of good stuff. And we were essentially left alone for the most part. I mean, sure, there's royal governors, but they don't really have any really true authority at this time. But the French and Indian War changes all that because now we're in debt and things start to change. And the British government wants to start to raise revenue. And it is this attempt to raise revenue where all of these problems are going to start to come from. And is this change towards, as we mentioned last time, parliamentary sovereignty. Now, the first example of parliamentary sovereignty was in 1763. In our last video, we talked about the proclamation line, which forbid colonists to go into the Ohio River Valley. And this really upset a lot of us because we weren't making the laws. And Parliament's really going to start to kind of knuckle down on the colonies. And the other thing that they're going to do as a result here is they're going to start to tax us, and they'll tax us without our consent. And the whole point behind the taxation was that the taxes were meant to raise revenue to pay off the war debt from the French and Indian War, as well as to pay for British troops that were still in the colonies helping to protect the colonies. So the first law that is passed, 1765, it is the infamous Stamp Act. And all of this stuff is this colonial British action and colonial reaction. So we've got this kind of back and forth, this tug of war that goes on. And so we'll notice this pattern throughout the entire thing. So the British action, they start off, they pass what's called the Stamp Act. Now the Stamp Act, it requires colonists to purchase special stamps for the payment of this tax. Now, it's not on the slide here, but you need to know it. The Stamp Act taxed paper products. All right, it primarily taxed paper products. And the very first slide of this lecture had an example of one of those stamps on it. Now, the colonials were incredibly incensed by this. They're really mad because, I mean, it's not a tax that's passed by us as colonists. It's a tax that's passed by the British. And so this goes against, really, at this point, 150, 160 years of tradition of self-rule. So the colonists, they harass tax collectors. There's a pretty famous picture in the room of tax collectors being tarred and feathered, and they prepare what's called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, essentially saying that what the British had done was not right in terms of taxing us. And we see mob reactions. And for instance, we've got the governor's house in Massachusetts is literally burned to the ground. I mean, he is able to barely escape out the back door. We start to see these colonists, refer to each other as patriots against the cause of the Stamp Act. They even form an organization called the Stamp Act Congress to protest against the Stamp Act. Now we see in this image, you can see, for instance, in the upper right-hand corner, in New York City, they're protesting the Stamp Act. They're hanging people. They're hanging people in what are called effigy. So they're not really hanging them in the background, but what they're doing is they're hanging basically straw men, to help really harass the tax collectors. Essentially saying, look, if you're going to collect the tax, this is what's going to really happen to you. Now, the second key idea here was that there's important people and groups that are leading a lot of these protests. So you have groups like the Stamp Act Congress, which I mentioned, but two other ones that you really want to know include the Sons of Liberty and the Daughters of Liberty. And these are two really important early groups that boycott and effectively help to repeal the Stamp Act. Both of them are going to be formed in resistance to the Stamp Act, but they'll be around for other events later on, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of the other things that they do. So the Stamp Act protests are really, really successful, and in 1766, the British government repeals the Stamp Act, but immediately they pass another law that's called the Declaratory Acts, which say that, we're going to get rid of the Stamp Act, but we can declare, we have the right to declare laws in the future that we want to. Hence, the next year, they bring in what's called the Townshend Acts, 1767. And so they're going to try again. Okay, you don't want us to tax paper? Okay, fine. Let's tax other stuff. And so what they're going to do is they're going to tax a series of different items. And this is, instead of a direct tax, which is what the Stamp Act was, this was an indirect tax, including lead, glass, paper, tea, etc. And what we see is the colonial reaction to this is, once again, we start hearing this phrase for the first time, no taxation without representation. And the groups start to boycott. They also start to harass tax collectors as well. They're tarring and feathering them, like you see in this image right here, this famous image. And so it's once again the Sons and Daughters of Liberty, and we start to see colonial leaders, especially in places like in Boston, people like Sam Adams becomes very important in this resistance to the Townshend Acts or the Townshend duties. In addition to this, other groups are formed as well. The colonists create a group that's called the Committees of Correspondence. Now, this is really significant because the Committees of Correspondence, what they start to do is they start to communicate between different colonies about what's happening with the British. And one of the points I made about colonialism in our previous unit was that the colonies hadn't really worked together with one another. There wasn't really much that had gone on in between colonies. I mean, really the first, pan-colonial event was the Great Awakening until the French and Indian War, and even the Albany Plan of Union, the join or die snake cartoon, that doesn't even work. But the Committees of Correspondence do start to work, and they make the colonies start to talk to each other, and it forms at least an initial framework for the colonies to work together against the British. Now, the Boston Massacre in 1770 is another kind of rallying, unifying event of colonists against the British. Now, the famous story is that British soldiers, which were stationed in large numbers in Boston, Massachusetts, are outside what's called the Customs House, which is where the taxes were collected. They were being harassed and taunted by an angry mob, as you can read there, and they fire into the crowd. We're not sure exactly what happens, but someone yells fire and the troops shoot, and several people are killed. Now, it may not exactly meet the definition of a massacre, but it is etchings like this one by the famous artist of Boston, Paul Revere, who make it a bestseller and really starts to turn public opinion against the British across the entire American colonies. Now, in reality, the colonists, were throwing snowballs and oyster shells and rocks at the British. And it's for dead, not exactly a massacre, but colonial propaganda is pretty important here. Now, we go a couple of years where things calm down a little bit. But then in 1773, the British passed what's called the Tea Act. Now, this gives the British East India Tea Company basically a monopoly. And colonists across the colonies are pretty upset about this. Using the committees of correspondence, they coordinate an effort to reject tea at all major ports in places like Boston, Philadelphia, and Charleston, South Carolina. The British East India Tea Company ships are refused entry into the harbor and have to turn around. But in Boston, they're allowed to dock. And the colonists of Boston do the incredibly famous thing of sneaking, quote unquote, onto ships and dumping 18,000 pounds of British tea into the harbor, the Big Tea Party. Though based on this painting, it wasn't exactly like they snuck onto the ships. There was a crowd there. The king is incensed. King George III is incensed by this. This is a direct violation of his own laws, and he feels like this is a direct slap in the face to him. And so he wants to make sure that Boston especially is punished for this action. So in 1774, the British government passes what are called the Intolerable Acts. Well, that's what we called them. The British called them the Coercive Acts, basically meant to coerce or force Boston to basically start acting right. And so it does a few things. It closes Boston Harbor. It puts more troops into Boston, and it also forces the troops to be quartered in houses. It also, at the same time, they passed something called the Quebec Act, which gave a ton of land from Massachusetts to Quebec, which Massachusetts people were pretty mad about. And it also forced the city of Boston to pay back the debt from the 18,000 pounds of tea. The reaction is that we form the First Continental Congress. And we declare, once again, what's called the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. And so we start to prepare for what may be a war. And more troops arrive in Boston. Eventually, there's over 5,000 British troops that are located in Boston. And around in the colonies, in the surrounding town, men have started to arm themselves. They've started to prepare guns and weapons and stores. And one of the main places that they've put most of this stuff is in a small town about 19 miles outside of Boston, a little place called Concord. Now, the man in charge of the British troops is a guy named General Gage. And so he receives orders from London to go seize the weapons that are believed to be in Concord. And so he sends 800 troops marching 19 miles in the middle of the night to Concord, Massachusetts to try and seize these weapons. However, literally thousands of Americans, of colonists, turn out to fight them. And they're named Minutemen since they were ready to fight at a minute's notice. And they engage in battle with these troops and nearly wipe out the British force, who's barely able to get back to Boston exhausted. The shots that are fired at Lexington and Concord, and by the way, the British find almost nothing on this trip, except for a lot of bullets whizzing around their ears. Their trip comes to really mostly nothing. Of course, there is the famous ride by Paul Revere. But the shots that are fired at Lexington Green and become known as the shots heard around the world. And much of it, what led up to this point, was England's insistence on changing its colonial policies from that of salutary neglect to parliamentary sovereignty. We'll discuss what happens next, including the beginnings of the American Revolution and the ideas that form the basis behind our own very own Declaration of Independence. But that's next time. Until then, go Pack.